I want to start this video with a brief detour through the annals of art history, from the statues that adorned ancient Rome, through the Renaissance and Baroque period, all the way to Edward Manet's Luncheon on the Grass, which led to the Salon des Refus, arguably marking the birth of the modern art era. It's argued by feminist art critics that voluptuousness denoted affluence in times of relative scarcity, and therefore proves that social and cultural changes cause variability in what we find attractive. To the extent that there may be some modicum of truth to this observation, I don't think that the commissioned portraits of the affluent necessarily represent what was sexually ideal to the average man of the age. There is, however, a surprisingly far lesser known and far more sensible explanation for the bulky size of females that appeared throughout the works of the Renaissance and Baroque period. An explanation which, unlike the social constructivist theory put forward by academic feminists, doesn't require any magical fluctuations in biological fitness markers that evolved over thousands of generations to form an innate reproductive preference in the human animal. You see, thanks to the ubiquitous control and prudish nature of the church, it was all but impossible for artists to get nude female models. Far from being proof of socially evolving beauty standards, the females of Michelangelo were all created from the bodies of male models, which he then basically just grafted breasts and feminized faces onto. Conservative Catholics may not appreciate my choice of phrasing here, but the roof of the Sistine Chapel is literally covered with pin-ups of ladyboys. Feminists just love to point to this period of art history as proof for their social constructivist theories about changing female beauty standards, but for the most part, their supposed proof from this period doesn't even depict real females in the first place, much less something that represented the ideal woman of the age. Far from the feminist theory, what the Baroque and Renaissance period really represents are severely compromised approximations of the female form that artists like Michelangelo and Peter Paul Rubens were forced to make due to the limited selection of life models available to them at the time. In fact, there is even quite a lot of speculation that the Mona Lisa, arguably the most famous painting in history, is actually a feminized self-portrait of Da Vinci himself. Even as late as the 1880s, the use of young, attractive prostitutes and dancers as life models by the emerging Impressionist artists like Edgar Degas and Toulouse-Lautrec was still seen as quite uncouth by their classically trained contemporaries. And it was this very display of real, unbridled sexuality in a regular garden setting that ultimately got Manet's Luncheon on the Grass refused from the Salon in the first place. But we're slightly drifting off topic. I can't think of a better example to build an accurate timeline for the idealized female form than the artistic depictions of the mythical character Venus, otherwise known to the Greeks as Aphrodite. I mean, what could be a better comparison of female physical idolatry through the ages than the artistic depiction of the Roman goddess who stood as the very embodiment of love and beauty? Aphrodite of Knidos, circa 350 BCE, Venus de Milo, circa 115 BCE, Venus de Medici, circa 100 BCE, Venus Felix, circa 150 CE, Sandro Botticelli's Birth of Venus, circa 1485 CE, and my personal favourite, William Adolphe Bouguereau's painting by the same name, 1879 CE. There is some variation in form and stylization, but these idealistic, deified representations of femininity, beauty, and sexuality spanning over 2 millennia are much more similar than they are different. Between the Roman Empire and the Renaissance, there is a conspicuous gap in groundbreaking high art during the so-called Dark Ages. But even the primitive, cartoonish depictions of women we can find from the Dark Middle Ages all points to a rather lithe, petite feminine form. And that's without even getting into the topic of historical non-Western depictions of the deified female form, such as Tara and Lakshmi, who boast almost identical proportions to their idealistic Western counterparts. These depictions of Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, all speak to a consistent, unchanging biological standard of what we find sexually and therefore reproductively attractive in the human female, a standard which transcends time and culture. It's so biologically consistent that we are even able to quantify this attractiveness in real, measurable scientific ways. Bilateral symmetry, the golden ratio, hip-to-waist ratio, relative proportions of certain features associated with neoteny. Slight variations notwithstanding, none of these idealized representations of female beauty resemble Rebel Wilson, and there is a very good reason for that. She's fucking grotesque. Despite what feminists will argue, there is a big difference between fertile voluptuousness and morbid obesity. Now, it's interesting that they keep trying to conscript the image of Marilyn Monroe into their little fat-positive cause, but let's be honest, Marilyn Monroe is in no way fat. Side-by-side comparison, one of these things is not like the other things. Ultimately, these consistent depictions of Venus throughout history represent a fixed ideal of biological reproductive fitness that evolved over countless millennia and really hasn't undergone any noticeable change throughout the relatively short duration of recorded human history. You know it, I know it, hell, the fat fucking feminists know it, we're just not really allowed to say it. Instead, we're expected to dance around singing about how Rebel Wilson is really wonderful and beautiful and amazing, a body-positive inspiration to women everywhere. It's an empress wears no clothes situation if ever I've seen one, but the question is, why? If biology precedes culture and culture precedes ideology, why is this happening? From a biological standpoint, obesity is objectively a bad thing. It leads to coronary heart disease, it leads to type 2 diabetes, strokes, high blood pressure, fatty liver disease, certain cancers including kidney, pancreatic and bowel cancer, chronic conditions like sleep apnea, gout, osteoarthritis and back pain. From an objectively measurable standpoint of morbidity and mortality, being overweight is not good for you, and as a result of this clear biological reality, obesity is therefore culturally and socially seen as a bad thing. It telegraphs a lack of genetic fitness. It telegraphs poor self-control. It telegraphs that somebody has very little self-respect or concern for their own health, and if you live in a country like mine that has a universal healthcare system, it telegraphs that someone has very little respect for the rest of society who ultimately have to carry their weight, so to speak. In summary, being fat is socially seen, and with very good reason, as extremely undesirable. Fat people are not considered by society to be attractive. So the question is, if being fat goes against our biology and goes against our cultural preferences, how is it possible that an ideological movement of fat acceptance, as well as its various shibboleths like fat shaming, have gained some kind of mainstream traction? And when I say mainstream, I do not mean the regressive left, I mean everyone. From the Young Turks...
She strikes me as someone who's actually trying to make a very serious and very terrible statement about overweight people with this facade of comedy.
All the way to Fox News.
Surprisingly, the discrimination was in most two places, or what we call fat shaming. People feeling bad when they had physical barriers, like not being able to find clothes that fit or fit into the airplane seat.
Well, the answer to that lies in Austin Powers 2, The Spy Who Shagged Me. Yeah, bear with me. Lately, I've been speaking quite a lot about media representation. Not from the activist standpoint of feminists and MRAs who believe that these prevalent stereotypes are actually causing the harm and therefore must be stopped, but rather that these media representations do provide some insight into the common behavioural expectations of the human animal. It's really a lot like the artwork we just covered. Depictions of Venus over the ages obviously don't prove a several millennia-long patriarchal conspiracy of fat shaming, but it does give some insight into the biologically fixed expectations of what we consider reproductively ideal in potential female mates. Our reality informs our art rather than the other way around. This includes certain biological realities, particularly those related to sexually dimorphic reproductive behaviour. This is why I mentioned in my last video that it is extremely unlikely you are going to see a gender-swapped version of the Vegas rape scene from Get Him to the Greek ever play out in a similarly toned female comedy like Bridesmaids. Whether or not you find this hypocritical is rather secondary. The fact is that our social standards of sexual violence against men and women are inherently different. I think the same could be largely said for the character of Fat Bastard from the Austin Powers franchise. Try to imagine a mainstream comedy that features a character called Fat Bitch, where every single joke is at the expense of how disgusting and unattractive she is.
I've not seen my Willie in 2 years, which is long enough to declare legally dead.
Imagine that joke reversed. Perhaps a joke where Fat Bitch has so many folds of fat that it would be impossible to find which one of them is her vagina. I just don't see it happening. Like Get Him to the Greek, I think swapping the gender of Fat Bastard would cross far too many social taboos to be considered acceptable by a mainstream audience. As an example, compare Fat Bastard to Fat Amy, Rebel Wilson's character in Pitch Perfect, where Fat Bastard existed only as a comic foil to be made fun of at the expense of his weight. Almost the complete opposite is true of Fat Amy. We are expected to sympathise with her. The jokes made at her expense are meant to make us feel bad, because, at least when it comes to women, true beauty is on the inside or some shit like that. Where men can be explicitly ridiculed for a physical characteristic like weight, women facing the exact same problem must be treated with deference. Where men are comic foils, women are victims of harassment. And when we take this perspective beyond fictional movie characters and out into the real world, some things become immediately apparent. I look at all of these complaints about offensive advertising campaigns, as well as advertising campaigns specifically engineered to virtue signal ideological support, and there is something noticeably consistent across virtually all of them. Where are all the men? Very few of these complaints appear to be about fat shaming specifically. Nobody cares one bit about the physique of Superman or Thor or Wolverine, but Wonder Woman. When Wonder Woman is used to cross-promote a product, it apparently sets unrealistic expectations for young women. Ultimately, what I'm getting at here is that fat shaming, the very term itself, is a malapropism or euphemism. A word has been intentionally left out for the purposes of plausible deniability, so that advocates can pretend that this conversation is happening within a framework of egalitarian social concerns. But when we talk about fat shaming, it is very clear that what we really mean is fat women shaming. Now, focusing on fat shaming is really only the tip of the iceberg. It's a window that opens out onto a much larger issue. It's something that I've discussed before in previous videos like suffrage and enfranchisement, but at the core of almost every successful identitarian social movement, there is some tie to female interests. Not necessarily ideological feminism, but the interests of regular everyday women. Fat women shaming is a rather obvious example, but this ever-present undercurrent of gynocentric concern pervades virtually every aspect of our culture, regardless of how mundane or unrelated the issue initially appears to be. I'm not usually up to date on all of the internet dramas going on, but when I saw that everyone was talking about this hashtag CNN blackmail, I decided to Google it to find out what was going on. The first article that comes up is this piece by Vox. It's fairly unremarkable, except that the author couldn't even get halfway through the article before he shoehorned in some fucking quote about Gamergate and female journalists. This isn't just the ethical lapse of a major news outlet doxing and blackmailing some anonymous Reddit user because he made a meme mocking their logo. Now, apparently CNN done bad because the poor women's get harassed online, and CNN is acting just like those evil Gamergate misogynists. I mean, what the actual fuck does this have to do with the situation at all? Ostensibly nothing, except that it isn't as newsworthy if it doesn't ultimately affect women in some peripheral capacity. I think the best example to explore this pervasive female concern framing is the European immigration crisis. Serious concerns about mass immigration across open borders from the Islamic world into mainland Europe largely fell on deaf ears or were actively derided as being nothing more than right-wing racism. That is, until New Year's Eve 2015 in Cologne, Germany, where a number of women were sexually assaulted in what appeared to be part of an Islamic sexual harassment game called Taharush Jamai. Now, as I recall at the time, there were actually quite a few men assaulted amongst the fray as well, including one guy who got his head curb-stomped into a coma. However, I cannot find any mention of this now. If my recollection is correct and there were in fact any male victims that night, they seem to have been almost entirely erased from history. Every single article that Google turns up mentions female victims and only female victims. The mass import of Islamic ideology into the West is not being treated as a social issue but almost exclusively a women's issue. Of course, memories are short, and as the fear for women's personal safety faded in the months that followed, things shifted right back to where they were previously. Perhaps even more so. Rather than just the regular gaggle of women holding their refugee welcome placards, at the extreme end, feminists were now starting to get increasingly vocal about the fact that they'd prefer rapists to racists. A few people have spoken about the concept of the Overton window. The idea that there is a window of acceptable discourse, in other words, the mainstream narrative. Opinions that fall too far outside this Overton window are considered to be extremist, and over time, as fringe ideas become less taboo, the Overton window of what is acceptable to discuss and in what way can shift. The thing I find interesting about the rather short timeline of the European immigration crisis is that we can almost see the Overton window shifting back and forth in real time. And it appears to be shifting back and forth in direct response to the immediate collective feelings of women. Irrelevant of whether you find this sentiment of rapists over racists nonsensical or completely fucking insane, the fact is that at every step of the way, the mainstream narrative and acceptable standard of discourse surrounding the issue of European immigration was being defined by the shifting collective sensibilities of women. And throughout this entire process, there is a consistent othering of people, specifically men, who don't sway in perfect time with this collective female attitude shift. When times are good, these contrarian men are labelled racist far-right bigots, and when times are bad, they're labelled misogynist rape apologists. If I had to summarise all of this as succinctly as possible, I can't think of a better way than to quote the words of Robert Briffaut. The female, not the male, determines all the conditions of the animal family. Where the female can derive no benefit from association with the male, no such association takes place. Now, Briffaut's law has been discussed at great length, specifically regarding the hypergamous nature of reproductive relationships. From where I'm sitting, the problem with Briffaut's law is that Robert Briffaut didn't go far enough with his definition. Women don't just determine all the conditions of the animal family, they determine all the conditions, period. Family, law, politics, social interactions, news coverage, technological innovations, fitness, employment and OHS, film, music and video games. The mainstream narrative of acceptable discourse and the so-called Overton window is being unilaterally defined by the sensibilities of the female half of society. If you were to draw it as a Venn diagram, what is considered socially acceptable would overlap almost 100% with what is acceptable to women. Right or wrong, if it offends or upsets women or even goes against the interests of women in some collective way, it will be seen as a societal taboo. The concerns of men? An afterthought perhaps? At best, you're only likely to see male concerns paid lip service where they nominally overlap with some other female interest. At a time when women are starting to demand monthly paid period leave, should we perhaps be having a frank discussion about the fact that women are already taking 42% more sick days than men? Well, let me educate you, privileged cis male scum. According to this wonderful little article featured on Essential Baby, it's actually a problem of discrimination against women because working men aren't taking time off to nurse their stay-at-home wives every time they get a case of the sniffles. But I digress. What we are biologically attracted to has not changed. However, our environment has changed. A world of easy, mechanised labour and transport, filled with deep-fried snacks and soft drinks laced with high-fructose corn syrup, has led to an obesity epidemic. And when a significant enough portion of women get fat, such that it actually becomes a women's issue, they will collectively demand that you now find obesity attractive. Jaded articles written by sad, bitter feminists crying about how men are bigots for not porking fatties are still somewhat fringe. Nonetheless, the mainstream has come to accept the core terms and concepts of body positivity and fat shaming. Even though it flies in the face of medical facts, the Overton window on issues of weight and weight-related health has shifted, and it has shifted in perfect lockstep with the immediate interests of modern, overweight women. This trend in social acceptability isn't even limited to verbal discourse as such, but behaviour as well. I think one of the most interesting things I've seen relating to this in the last few months was an interview that Tim Pool did with Joey Salads, who infiltrated an Antifa protest so that he could report on the structure and operation of the Black Bloc from within the movement.
Multiple women were throwing rocks. It's a lot of the men were walking around with poles and sticks, but it's weird because the women are the dominant ones in their group. The men are like the submissive ones. So the women are the ones that control everything. They're mostly the troublemakers, from what I've seen.
I find this an extremely interesting perspective to hear. We tend to think of women as being outwardly passive and quite Machiavellian, largely relying on subtle emotional and sexual manipulation rather than overt violence to get what they want. But I wonder how much of that is projection. Do we simply ignore the things that we don't want to see? Even within MRA circles, the topic of proxy violence tends to be spoken about in hushed terms so as not to offend any female allies. But here we have openly violent political street gangs goose-stepping through the streets, actively committing criminal damage and assault, and it appears that the scale and direction of this violence is being explicitly determined by the women, not the men of the group. If this is really what's happening behind the scenes in real-world violent political street riots, is it surprising to anyone how things happen on the internet? Like the discussion of Islam being almost entirely reduced in the mainstream to a shallow debate about how bad Sharia law is for women, discussions surrounding the internet these days, as in discussions about the digital platform itself, seem to be centred around the online safety of women. Now, to be clear, it is very dangerous when the Arial 12-point font of the internet spills over into real-life action. Swatting, stalking, blackmail and extortion, trying to get people fired from their jobs and so on. But the RGB pixels which form a distasteful meme in and of themselves are not dangerous. And that, for the most part, is what's actually being talked about in discussions of online safety for women. When they say safety, they don't mean the real-world dangers of swatting, but the social atmosphere of the communication platform itself. The unsavory ideas, the jokes, the memes, the arguments, the video gaming trash talk that makes women feel unsafe. Dangerous ideas that are not socially sanctioned by the female consensus. The statistics show that women aren't any more likely than men to get harassed online. They are, however, twice as likely to get upset about it compared to men. Will the internet ever be safe for women? Like fat shaming, this is a malapropism. What they really mean is, will the internet ever be safe for women's feelings? When you also consider that half of the sexist harassment that women do face online actually comes from other women, a much clearer picture starts to form. Women are quite happy to break their own rules of etiquette, which they demand of everyone else, because the so-called problems that women face online are not really about harassment and safety at all, but about their ability to unilaterally exert control over the social framework. This is all really about whether the internet can be reined in to fit the Overton window of acceptable discourse that women have collectively approved. The real problem that women face online is that spaces like Reddit and 4chan afford men and to some extent contrarian women the ability to operate outside the Overton window. It affords them the ability to express what they want without the real-world social repercussions of going against the collective sensibilities of women. The female, not the male, determines all the conditions of the animal family. Well, that becomes a slightly more difficult biological imperative to fulfill on a digitally abstracted communication platform where users can essentially decide their own level of anonymity. After all, you can't control someone without some real-world leverage. Unsurprisingly, the main push to clean up the internet, as it were, seems to be a push towards the removal of online anonymity. We could essentially leave it at that. However, I think the issue of Briefo's law and the internet is actually a far deeper rabbit hole. At the end of the day, none of this is actually new. The sky isn't falling. Women haven't changed, men haven't changed, and despite what you might think, the lopsided social contract between men and women hasn't changed that much either. What we are seeing is the same old petty gender antagonism it's always been. The only difference is that, like the prevalence of high fructose corn syrup leading to obesity problems, the modern human environment has shifted in such a way that certain innate human social behaviours, particularly those of negative socialisation, have been amplified. 100 years ago, she would have handed you a white feather and called you a coward in front of your friends. Today, she will post your picture on Twitter and call you a misogynist in front of 50,000 people. Welcome to the current year, same as it ever was, just bigger. October 21st, 2015 was the date that Doc Brown and Marty McFly were supposed to arrive in the future, and everyone jokingly complained, "Where's my hoverboard and self-lacing Nikes?" Everyone was so busy asking what happened to the future that was promised to them in 80s sci-fi films that they missed what was happening right under their noses. Futurists and transhumanists talk wistfully about this technological singularity that's going to happen at some unspecified point in the future. I think we've already missed the boat. I think we've actually already experienced something of a technological singularity. We just weren't paying enough attention at the time to realise it. We wanted flying cars, instead we got 140 characters. I laughed my ass off when I first read that quote. I have never liked Twitter, and it seemed a rather poignant statement about the complacent slump in new technologies. But over time, the punchline has lost something of its charm. I think I seriously underestimated the impact and importance of Twitter. I think Peter Thiel may have as well. A stupid, adolescent celebrity in California can tweet whatever fucking nonsense pops into his head, and seconds later, that same thought will be shared halfway around the world in places as remote as the Serengeti with someone who has never even met the original progenitor of that thought. Twitter is not just some rinky-dink social network. For all intents and purposes, it is a primitive form of human telepathy. We are living at a time when human thoughts are being shared and human minds are being connected in ways that we couldn't even fathom 100 years ago when white feathers of shame had to be physically handed to individual men on street corners. What we have effectively constructed is a fully functional global human hive mind. 3.2 billion people, all digitally connected to form an emergent human superorganism of collective knowledge and consciousness. The problem is that the philosophers and creators at the frontier of this digital human thought network never stopped to consider how this technology would end up being driven by our already existing biological behaviours and biases. In typical hubris, we just assumed that this new technology would magically open up whole new vistas of enlightened human thought. For some reason, it never even occurred to us that this gargantuan technological hive mind would be every bit as irrational and gynocentric as the individual human minds that make up its collective whole. Wikipedia stands as a shining example of this hubris. An open repository to crowdsource all human knowledge for the betterment of mankind. What a wonderful and amazing concept, but who could have guessed that as little as a decade and a half later, and in spite of their supposedly neutral point of view practices, its executive body, the Wikimedia Foundation, would be not just endorsing, but actively funding feminist wiki editing campaigns to intentionally insert pro-female bias into the content of this open encyclopedia in hopes of making it more palatable to female sensibilities. In the words of Tyler Durden, what the fuck did you think was going to happen? Honestly, what did you think was going to happen? How did you really expect this to play out? We've constructed a functional human hive mind, but we never stopped to consider the ramifications of how that hive mind would ultimately reach a consensus on particular issues. Surprise! The collective hive mind reaches a consensus the same way its irrational individual minds do. At virtually every stage of human existence, we have seen the same reproductive gender biases across the species. DNA data showing large gender disparities in effective population size across both pre- and post-agrarian societies, meaning that at a conservative estimate, twice as many women over our evolutionary history have reproduced and passed on their DNA compared to men. Throughout antiquity, we hear stories about entire nations going to war because of a single woman like Helen of Troy. In modern history, even before women got the vote, it was the tender years doctrine, women and children first on the Titanic, suffragettes taking time away from their political campaigning to hand out white feathers. And today, we have Twitter. What has, in my opinion, come to be the de facto central nervous system of modern society. That may sound like an exaggeration, but compare it to almost any other competing digital communication platform. Even simple videos can be difficult to produce, meaning that YouTube has a rather high barrier to entry. Written blogs also require a lot of mental energy expenditure to read and write. Social media networks like Facebook and Google+ tend to keep their content isolated to connected groups of immediate friends and acquaintances. But Twitter is a different beast entirely. Here we have an open forum limiting the content to 140 character messages with a model designed almost entirely around disseminating these messages on the basis of majority consensus via a very clever system of popular retweeting and trending hashtags. It is a shit system for exploring or debating big ideas, but from an information sciences perspective, I cannot think of a better network design to quickly and efficiently distribute packets of social information to be processed across the collective hive mind. In this sense, Twitter could essentially be thought of as a very efficient human communication API for social multi-threading. The question is, what makes up the actual content of these digital packets of social information being distributed across the hive mind? According to a study which tracked emotional trends on the social network Weibo, essentially the Chinese government-approved version of Twitter, anger spreads between users as a direct result of interaction much more quickly and much more widely than any other emotion. When someone tweets news that angers them, that news, along with the angry sentiments accompanying it, are far more likely to be retweeted compared to happy or sad news. Anger, it seems, spreads like an emotional wildfire through social networks, meaning that the emergent primary function of the social network as a mass communication tool is actually for people to express and share outrage, thus, intentionally or not, engaging in mass negative socialization. Human behavioural biology has not changed in any meaningful or significant way. The internet has simply helped to streamline these innate human social tendencies and scale them up in a previously unfathomable way. And over here on the other side of the bamboo curtain, Twitter is at the centre of this. As I said, compared to all the competing methods of online communication, Twitter is the most refined for social multi-threading across the internet's hive mind. So it's no surprise that it's been adopted by virtually everyone, from Joe Nobodies to celebrity entertainers, multinational corporations, and federal politicians. That entire CNN blackmail debacle mentioned earlier all happened because the fucking President of the United States retweeted some GIF originally posted by an anonymous Redditor. Simply catching a glimpse of the president used to be a big deal, but there are no 6 degrees of separation anymore. The old monolithic structure of social governance has been made effectively obsolete and replaced with a new parallel system, where everyone can now directly communicate with everyone else on the same level. The authoritarian structures that now exist within this social framework are no longer the heads of state, but rather the social trends that organically emerge from this collective consensus. And what tends to organically emerge from this collective consensus are our underlying socio-biological behavioural biases, disproportionately anger, and specifically anger at anything that even remotely affects women in some negative way. Case in point, Gamergate. Women are apparently an oppressed minority, gamers are dead, and if you disagree at any point, you're a woman-hating misogynist. Anti-Gamergate is very clearly an authoritarian movement with all of the classic hallmarks. Dubious claims of victimhood followed by idea suppression through systemic othering based on identitarian group bias. But it is not one with an ideological leader or defined mandate that was voted for or even seized power. It is an oppressive, authoritarian social movement that organically grew out of mass social media consensus, ultimately rooted in our biologically innate and irrational concern for women. The federal government of my own country has already started to revoke travel visas on the basis of social media campaigns and online petitions. What type of individuals find themselves the subject of these social media campaigns? That evil misogynist rapper Tyler the Creator, wife-beater Chris Brown, and wicked anti-abortion activist Troy Newman. I don't even agree with everything that these individuals stand for, but do any of these 3 men really pose a serious security threat to the Commonwealth of Australia? Because the only real threat I see posed by these 3 men is a threat to the collective feelings of Australian women. However, with enough traction on social media, that on its own is enough of a reason for federal governments to start revoking visas. What happened to the future? Well, we missed it, didn't we? We thought it was just 140 characters, but traditional politics became obsolete right under our noses. At some point, Western civilization underwent a massive paradigm shift from representative democracy to direct democracy, and nobody even noticed. This is what 100,000 people marching on Washington used to look like. This is what 100,000 people marching on Washington looks like today. New digital platforms have expanded the methods of political engagement in such a way that you don't even need to turn off Netflix and leave the comfort of your couch to protest against the government. The barrier to political engagement has basically hit zero. When we think about the age of rebellion, we tend to think about the hippie era. The 2-decade-long Vietnam War saw hundreds of millions of dollars and, more importantly, hundreds of thousands of innocent lives wasted. On November 15th, 1969, the largest anti-war protest in American history saw 500,000 people take to the streets to protest young men being forcibly conscripted by their government to fight and die in somebody else's civil war happening halfway around the globe. The protests frankly didn't achieve much politically speaking, but it seemed a reasonable enough position to take against the government. Fast forward a few decades and we see the 2017 Women's March. Undisputedly, the largest single protest in American history by a rather wide margin, all because some narcissist fucking halfwit made the ham-fisted yet true statement that if you're rich and powerful and successful enough, women will let you grab them on the pussy. To this day, American men still have to sign the Selective Services Register on their 18th birthday. But a poorly worded statement about the hypergamous reproductive interests of women? Well, you can't just go around saying that sort of thing, don't you know? And at an estimated 3.3 to 4.6 million protesters across the US, boy oh boy did the women let us know. Now, I don't think this really represents a significant change in human behaviour between 1969 and 2017. I think new technology has simply brought a significant undercurrent of negative female sentiments that have always existed to the surface. In other words, same old behaviour, but it allowed a large-scale refocusing of social priorities. Back in the 60s, the Vietnam War was in everyone's faces. In Congress, on the streets, in music, on people's televisions. It was a widely recognised issue that people could rally around. Before the internet, however, there really wasn't an adequate platform for individual women to get together en masse and air their collective grievances, their collectively perceived microaggressions, if you will. As soon as the internet, along with services like Twitter, provided women a platform to do this, it turns out that on an aggregate societal scale, the combined collective grievances of women, regardless of how petty and inane, snowball to become a much bigger social issue than a single war that was happening somewhere in Southeast Asia. Today, you don't need a war. You just need a catchy hashtag like everyday sexism for people to rally around. Human social biology is a lot bigger than a fucking paper ballot that happens every 4 years. And that underlying social biology is exactly what this nascent technology allowed people to express. An organic, grassroots reformation of social structure and governance. For immigration, against Sharia, for Islamic women, against Trump, for women's safety on the internet, for body positivity, against Tyler the Creator. It was foolhardy for us to expect the hive mind would be any more rational than the individual minds that make up its collective whole. But the hive mind's irrationality wasn't exactly unpredictable either. Barbarossa once referred to humanity as being powered by orgasm. I think that is an exceptionally elegant way of putting it. In his video, he talks a little bit about trying to break this cycle by utilising new technology to get ahead of humanity's reproductive curve. I, however, am quite a bit more pessimistic about this. I think whatever technology we create, it is always going to be lagging behind our reproductive curve. The history of the Unix operating system can be traced all the way back to the late 1960s. As a result, some of its core design principles are quite outdated. Starting sometime in the mid-80s, AT&T and Bell Labs began working on Plan 9, a new operating system intended to be an industry-wide replacement for Unix. Most notably, they aimed to redesign the background daemon services which had to be communicated with via a complicated system of internal socket connections with an easily accessible virtual file system, where information could be traded back and forth between different subsystems via the standard operating system's I/O framework. To be honest, you don't even really need to understand what all of that means. You just need to know that Plan 9 was an objective improvement over Unix. In the long run, it may well have been a more efficient, well-designed system. However, on its commercial release in 1995, Plan 9 just didn't represent enough of an improvement to justify everyone in the tech industry throwing out 2 decades worth of legacy Unix infrastructure. And that's really the problem here. Legacy infrastructure. Ideology versus reality. Life is very rarely a simple matter of what could or would or should be ideal, but rather what is practically feasible. If there is any single point that Stardust and I disagree on, this would be it. Stardust often likes to theorise about a hypothetical pill that would supply us with all of our nutrient needs, whilst at the same time acting as a kind of neural inhibitor to effectively suppress any natural desire we would have for food. Looking past my extreme skepticism that such a wonder drug is anything other than a completely fantastical impossibility, even if it were developed, I am thoroughly unconvinced that the majority of people would actually want to take it. There is a reason why the birth control pill has seen widespread adoption, but anaphrodisiac drugs, aka reversible chemical castration, has not. The pill doesn't simply solve the problem of unwanted pregnancy. I mean, abstinence can do that. You don't fuck, you don't get pregnant. The pill solved the problem in such a way that we could indulge in our base biological desire for sex more than we ever have before without the unwanted cost. Unlike anaphrodisiacs, it solved the problem by actually catering to our legacy biological systems rather than trying to actively fight them, suppress them, force them to fit an ideology, or excise them entirely. I mean, this is the very foundation for the entire field of human factors. Our understanding of ergonomics goes far beyond correct posture for a desk chair. We now understand that our technology also has to account for human behaviour, including some of its more irrational and emotional aspects. There is a psychological reason why stoplights are red. There is a physiological reason why we have ultimately settled on a widescreen aspect ratio for film and television. There is a neurological reason why we prefer text arranged into narrow vertical columns. And there is a reason why Twitter functions the way it does too. Like the birth control pill and stoplights and widescreen televisions and newspaper print columns, Twitter is a biological best fit for our evolved social communication needs. And whether you like it or not, a big part of that evolved sociobiology is related to sexual dimorphism and reproduction. The female, not the male, determines all the conditions of the animal family. Where the female can derive no benefit from association with the male, no such association takes place. Assuming that Robert Briffaut was even remotely correct, why is it surprising to anybody that 90 years after he wrote these words, Twitter, the predominant social communication framework, would, by popular female demand, eventually start filtering unpopular thought through a trust and safety council, heralding women's organisations like Feminist Frequency, Women Action in the Media, and Hollaback as the vanguard, whilst at the same time removing contrarian men like Milo Yiannopoulos from the platform entirely. Equally unsurprising is how the clunkiest social communication networks like Facebook and Google are slowly starting to follow Twitter's lead. This is simply a case of our technology catering to our innate gynocentric nature. To the extent that some platforms have a mission statement claiming that they will never adopt these kind of identitarian censorship practices, I think the result of that, provided they keep their word, will also be that those platforms never see anything approaching widespread adoption. You know, Plan 9 versus Unix. It's a nice ideal, but it just doesn't have enough backwards compatibility with our legacy biological instincts to actually work. Many of these concepts were theorized by Donald Norman in his book Emotional Design, and there is a reason why virtually every designer, marketing executive, and cognitive psychologist has a copy of this book sitting somewhere in their bookshelf. The bizarre atomic juicer on the front cover sums up the concept of emotional design perfectly. It's not enough to simply design a product that people need. In a saturated marketplace, you have to design a product that people actually want on a visceral emotional level. The unfortunate fact is that on a visceral emotional level, the average person who needs a communication platform like Twitter doesn't actually want the same open society that you want. The average person will happily trade intellectual freedom for the comfort of perceived safety, particularly the perceived safety of the women folk. And do not underestimate the collective power of this gynocentric instinct. We as a species will yield and literally turn a blind eye not just to the medical facts, but our own reproductive preferences as men to pretend that obesity is now okay because enough women have started to feel bad that they can't stop stuffing Big Macs into their disgusting face holes. This is really the core problem with libertarian philosophy. Just get rid of the government. Well, to varying degrees, we've apparently done that already. Twitter is about as anarchistic as it gets. The problem is that people, the real people who make up that system, anarchist or otherwise, are not inherently libertarian leaning. Even without any kind of centralised government, authoritarian social movements like Stop Gamergate and Everyday Sexism, which engage in very oppressive thought policing via mass social coercion, will still organically arise through group consensus. The stock market is a rather perilous place, and Twitter, the company, may eventually collapse like many people are hoping it will. But whatever platform replaces it will probably look almost identical, right down to the feminist-led Trust and Safety Council. It is a matter of convergent evolution. Our technological innovations will always converge on a best fit for our fixed biology. As a result, whatever system we design to act as a platform for mass human communication will inevitably see the emergent biases of human social structure start to surface on that platform. Our technology is unfortunately a double-edged sword. We cannot streamline people's ability to mass communicate without also streamlining their ability to engage in mass social bias.